So the process of sensation. What are the steps for the process of sensation? The first step is stimulation of sensory receptor. And as we said before, in order for a sensory receptor to be stimulated, there have to be two conditions met. The first thing is that the stimulus should be specific for this type of sensory receptor. The second thing is that it should be within the receptive field of this receptor. The receptive field is the region in the body that's when stimulated, it will activate this type of receptor and produce a response. Here's an example. This is sensory receptor 1, this is 2, and this is 3. If the stimulus came in this area and stimulate this sensory receptor, then this information will be transmitted to the CNS through the sensory neurons number 1. However, if this stimulus was occurring here in this region, then that will stimulate all of the 3 sensory receptors. So all of them will transmit this information through sensory neurons to the central nervous system. The smaller the receptive field, the more specific is the sensation. Now let's say the stimulus came that's specific to this type of sensory receptor and within its receptive field. What will be the next step? The next step will be sensory transduction. And transduction means conversion of whatever the type of energy in this stimulus into receptor potential or a graded potential. For example, if it's a sensory receptor in the inner ear, it will convert the energy of the sound waves into receptor potential or electrical type, which is graded potential. If the stimulus is light, then the photoreceptor will convert these electromagnetic radiations or the light waves into receptor potential. It's important to remember, as we said before, that receptor potential is a graded potential, not an action potential. So remember the differences between the graded potential and the action potential as in the following slides. If we are talking specifically about the neurons, then graded potential arises in the dendrites and the soma or the cell bodies of the neurons, whereas the action potential is transmitted throughout the axons and starts in the axon helix. Remember that in order to activate or start an action potential, there should be activation of voltage-gated channels, more specifically the sodium channels. And for the graded potential, it's only either ligand-gated or mechanically gated ion channels. Another thing distinguishes action potential from graded potential, that it's for long-distance communication or propagative action, where the communication is or the conduction is decremental. It's for short-distance communication in the graded potential. A distinguishing feature of action potential, it follows the all or none principles, which means that it has the same amplitude regardless of the strength of a stimulus, unlike in graded potential, in which the strength of a stimulus, if it varies, then the amplitude will vary accordingly. In general, the duration of graded potential is longer than that of the action potential. And as you know that action potential always follows the same type of polarity, changing in polarity, in which it has a depolarizing phase followed by a repolarizing phase. However, in graded potential, it can be either hyperpolarizing or depolarizing. And this is very important to remember when we are talking about receptor potentials, specifically that it can be either hyperpolarizing or depolarizing to transmit different types of messages. Also remember that there is a refractory period in action potential and summation is not present. However, in the graded potential, there is summation and there is no refractory period. This is an illustration of how the amplitude of the graded potential will vary according to the strength of the stimulus. The stronger the stimulus, the greater the change in the membrane potential. Back to the process of sensation. Let's say that this sensory receptor was stimulated by a specific stimulus in its specific receptive field, and that will result in transduction that's converted into receptor potential. If this receptor potential reaches a threshold, then that will be a generation of nerve impulse, or what we call it action potential, that will be propagated and transmitted up to the central nervous system. If it didn't reach the threshold, then this receptor potential will die out, and that type of information will not reach to the central nervous system. This is an illustration of the different strength of the stimuli effect on the membrane potential. If it's a subthreshold stimulus, then it will not result in an action potential. No action potential, no propagation to the central nervous system. So it should be at least threshold stimulus for the action potential to reach to the central nervous system. Now what happens if this stimulus is even stronger? Let's say two stimuli, stimulus 1 was applying pressure on the skin. However, stimulus 2, we applied stronger pressure on the skin. How that would reach to the central nervous system? It's actually the frequency of action potentials will be increased. So that will be interpreted by a central nervous system as a stronger stimulus. Again, this is illustrating that stimulus intensity, the more the intensity of the stimulus, the more the frequency of firing action potentials. The more is the receptor potential above threshold. As we mentioned previously, summation is a feature of a graded potential. Therefore, it can be either temporal summation or spatial summation. A stronger stimulus may result in a spatial summation, which means activation of different sensory receptors or sensory neurons. So increase the surface area that is stimulated means a stronger stimulus that will be interpreted by the central nervous system as a spatial summation. Or an increased intensity of the stimulus or the strength of this stimulus can be interpreted by the central nervous system due to temporal summation, which means increasing the frequency of firing impulses or action potentials during a specific time, reflecting a stronger stimulus. One of the important characteristics of sensory receptors is what we call it adaptation. Adaptation means decrease in the amplitude of receptor potential despite the constant stimulus, which means less frequency of firing action potentials, and then the perception of this sensation may disappear or fade. An example of this adaptation is that when you wear your watch, so the first thing you wear your watch, then you have this perception, this conscious awareness that you are wearing your watch. But with time, you will not be thinking about it. You will not have this perception about it, although your watch is still on your hand, applying the same sensory stimulus, which is pressure on your hand. But you're not consciously aware of it. And this is because what we call it adaptation. And adaptation is a very important feature because the central nervous system, or the nervous system in general, has too many things to care about it and to work on it. You don't want to worry this nervous system about things that's not important all the time. So you don't have to remind yourself all the time that you are wearing a watch. You know when you wear it, and you know when you take it off. You know when you look at it. But you don't have to always be thinking about it all through the day. So this is an important mechanism to conserve the energy of the nervous system. Sensory receptors vary in their speed of adaptation. Some sensory receptors, such as Pacinian corpuscle, they are very rapidly adapting sensory receptors. They are pressure receptors. However, some other sensory receptors, such as muscle spindles that are present in the muscles, provide information, proprioceptive information about the stretching of the muscle. They are slowly adapting. Some sensory receptors, they are almost non-adapting, such as the pain receptor. And this is important for the function of the sensory receptor. For example, when I say that pain receptors do not adapt, this is very important because you want the body to be always reminded, to always receive information about this stimulus that's causing the pain until you do something about it, because it's causing tissue damage. However, for Pacinian corpuscles, or the pressure receptors, you can detect it when you have this pressure, but you don't have to remind yourself that there is a pressure stimulus all the time. Until a change happens, then it will be activated again. For muscle spindle, it's important to be slowly adapting because you want always information reaching the central nervous system about the degree of stretch of these different types of muscles, to know the position of the muscle, the movement around the joints, and to predict the next step or the next type of movement. This is showing the difference between two types of receptors. The first one is the rapidly adapting receptor, or in other words, phasic receptor. And this is the slowly adapting receptor, or a tonic receptor. Let's say here is the stimulus, and the stimulus is constant and continuous all through this period. When the stimulus is applied, there is a firing of receptor potential here, reaching a threshold. Then there is action potential reaching the central nervous system, telling that there is a stimulus. Although the stimulus is present here, there is rapid adaptation of this receptor. There is no need to continue in the amplitude, high amplitude of the receptor potential, and so the firing until the end of the stimulus, which will be detected here, and action potential will reach the CNS, marking the end of this stimulus. This is in rapidly adapting receptors. However, in the slowly adapting or the tonic receptor, when the stimulus starts, there is a receptor potential above a threshold. That means action potentials are firing with increasing frequencies. The frequencies will decline over time, but it will be continuous all through the time that there is a stimulus until it ends, so there is no more receptor potential, no action potentials. Some examples of the slowly adapting receptors are the pain receptors. As we said previously, that this type of stimulus that you don't want to adapt on it. You want to continuously reminding the body about there is tissue damage. Also baroreceptors, that's telling us about the blood pressure, changes in blood pressure. So you should be slowly adapting in order to correct these changes in blood pressure. Just like the chemoreceptors also, that's detecting the changes in the osmolality of body fluid. Proprioceptors telling us about the position and movements around the joints. Now I just want you to notice that adaptation can be at the level of the sensory receptor, or it can be higher up in the central nervous system, which you will take in details in the third year, inshallah. About the sensory receptors, the mechanism of adaptation is different with different types of sensory receptors according to their type of structure and the type of stimulus. An example is the mechanism of adaptation in Pacinian corpuscles or Pacinian corpuscle, which is type of a pressure receptor that we said it's encapsulated nerve endings. So because it's mechanoreceptor, when there is a mechanical stimulus, that's a pressure, that will lead to deformation of this area, that's a pressure applied on it, leads to activation of mechanically gated ion channels, resulting in a receptor potential. If it reaches a threshold, then it will be propagated as an action potential throughout the sensory neurons to the central nervous system. And so, because it's a very rapidly adapting sensory receptor, the mechanism of action of this adaptation, it can be one of two ways. Despite the presence of this mechanical stimulus, there may be a redistribution of the fluid, of the viscoelastic fluids that's present in this area, resulting in the decrease in receptor potential. The other probable mechanism is inactivation of the ion channels that are present here, so there is no more receptor potential, despite that the stimulus is still there. So we learn now about sensory coding by the central nervous system and how it can distinguish different properties of the stimuli. For example, the central nervous system can know this type of sensory modality by what we call the labeled line principle, the location of this stimulus by knowing where it was the receptive field. It knows the intensity or the strength of a stimulus by having spatial or temporal summation, and the duration of the stimulus through adaptation. Thank you for your attention. We will continue discussing about neuronal synapses next lecture, inshallah.